Disney and director James Gunn make announcements in terms of upcoming film releases. A new segment gets introduced on the show today, and not only do I review my top 5 films of the 1960s, but I also have a major announcement to share with you guys. I'm Joe Acierno, this is Real Talk. Lack of originality and political preachiness. These problems that plague our entertainment industry today are the reasons that you'll be thankful tomorrow for the creation of Natural Multimedia. I'm proud to announce today on this show the inception of this creative force dedicated to honest, bold, and original viewing experiences that'll ensnare both the mind and the soul. Upon my mounting aggravation with the big media complex, I decided to do some research and see just how many people have the same feelings that I do in terms of the content that's thrown their way. In my growing findings, I've found that most people not only don't trust the news media to give them the full and complete story, but that they're also tired of seeing everything we've seen before in motion pictures. What's this entity doing to solve that problem? Well, on top of the show being officially connected with the Natural Multimedia brand, I'm currently working with a number of enthusiastic collaborators on multiple short films, feature films, web television series, as well as a new segment program. I've already set up several social media profiles for this entity. You can follow and share its Instagram page at natural_multimedia, as well as the Facebook and LinkedIn pages titled Natural Multimedia. To cap off this big announcement, I can't stress enough for you to take the media consumption survey, whose link can be found in connection with all social media profiles associated with Natural Multimedia. If you have any concerns with the survey or anything else with the company, don't be hesitant to send an email to naturalmultimedia2020@gmail.com. This company isn't just a plan for the short game. It's a plan for the long haul that it'll take to change media for the better. How do you climb a mountain? One rock at a time. Alright, so like I said before, don't be hesitant to follow any of the social media pages. I've already tried to get the notoriety up and working as far as those, so please, like I said, don't be shy. So, moving on. I guess some encouraging and some not so encouraging news as far as films that have been anticipated as far as their release dates. Disney just made the announcement that they are pushing back their release dates for both Soul and Raya and the Last Dragon. I remember on, I believe it was the last episode, that I was particularly concerned with them pushing back Soul because I figured it was going to be one of the big, first big major motion picture releases of this upcoming summer after hopefully all this coronavirus craziness just dies down, at least starts to subside. But no, I guess they're making the safe move, Disney and Pixar, and just they're pushing back to November 20th of this year, which is right around Thanksgiving weekend, which ironically enough was around the same time frame that Raya and the Last Dragon was supposed to come out this year, but they're pushing that back to March 12th of next year instead. On the upside, they did just announced the release date for Captain Marvel 2, and that's slated to come out on July 8th of 2022. Now, I finally got around to watching the first Captain Marvel, and it was fine. It was all right. Definitely a bit overhyped. I remember, to quote my good friend Mike Scudero, he said it was very okay. And to use the same phrase that I used when describing Bohemian Rhapsody, it was aggressively mediocre. It was fine. It did what it had to do. It was a good time, but I think in terms of like the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's definitely among the more underwhelming films for sure. But again, it was worth the watch. It was worth the watch for the family movie night that my family and I had on Easter Sunday. Now that we finally got Disney Plus and are taking huge advantage of everything that service has to offer. And no, I'm not being paid by them to say that. And some more encouraging news from director James Gunn. He announced within the last few days that the release dates for his next couple of films, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and The Suicide Squad, the reboot of the 2016 film, for the, sort of reboot, a decent amount of cast seems to be coming back, but neither film has any plans to delay anything. They're still either ahead of schedule or on schedule, so they're both slated to come out in 2021. Suicide Squad in particular is slated to come out August 6th of 2021. No concrete release date for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 other than just the year that's supposed to come out. So, that's all I really have to say about that. So, some kind of half and half news. I'm still hanging on for Tenet to hopefully not be delayed. That movie comes out in July. Some people are saying that, movie theaters aren't aren't going to be coming out and opening up again until around July. Maybe Tenet will be the first big motion picture release to come out and grace the silver screens once they're finally open again. So, we'll see what happens as far as that. All right, so moving forward, as I said in the intro to this particular episode, I'm happy to debut a new segment on the show today called Film Fights, where basically I just take two different films that are similar in one way or another, and I analyze them piece by piece in terms of like everything that goes into making the film, such as like the acting and the storytelling and all that jazz. Kind of like what I do when I review individual movies, but instead I'm just pitting two different movies against each other. So since this past weekend was indeed Easter weekend, and I managed to watch both The Passion of the Christ and The Last Temptation of Christ in one weekend, I figured, let me start off this particular segment with doing those two films. So now this isn't to necessarily say which one is the best, or at least my favorite movie to watch around Easter time. For me, personally, that movie was Ben-Hur, not the one that came out a few years ago, the one from the 1950s. That one is just a masterpiece and should just be left alone, shouldn't be made again. And if you have 3.5 hours, I know it's a gigantic runtime, but if you have that amount of time, as well as attention span and patience, it's definitely worth the watch. It's an incredible film. But going back to the two movies that I'm going to talk about today, they were both very controversial films when they were released, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything about like the quality of the films itself. They're both terrific movies. They're both radically different approaches to similar subjects. The Passion of the Christ, which came out in 2004, is directed by Mel Gibson. This one focuses more on just the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, including his brutal crucifixion, and as opposed to The Last Temptation of Christ, which was directed by Martin Scorsese, which is a fictitious approach to the life of Jesus Christ, which kind of theorizes the internal conflicts that he may not have carried throughout his entire life. So now, again, with the ways that I'm going to compare and contrast these two different films, and in the end pick out which one is my winner, I decided to do it in the categories of direction, writing, acting, music, and visuals. So I'm just going to go piece by piece and just kind of like assign a checkpoint just assign a point to each particular film for each particular category. So starting out with the visuals. Now both these movies have a very distinct visual style, but there's something about The Passion of Christ that even though both these films like kind of feel haunting in the way they portray certain things, and I'm gonna give a slight edge to The Passion of the Christ. And again, I don't know if that's just because the movie is a bit newer, so they had more of a chance to be up to date with more modern film technologies. But The Passion of the Christ, as much as both these films were beautifully filmed, and the production and costume design were absolutely outstanding, The Passion of the Christ in particular not only has like some more haunting imagery in terms of its portrayal of the devil, but the makeup that they used and the angles that they were used to just capture every last bit detail of brutality that unfortunately was afflicted on Jesus Christ during his crucifixion. It's just heart-wrenching and just like stomach churning, and I can't help but admire that particular direction for which Mel Gibson decided to go into. So that the point for visuals, I'm going to give the edge to The Passion of the Christ. In terms of music, the musical scores for both these movies are terrific, but it's very weird. Like I noticed like how much I like each particular score, but the one for The Passion of the Christ seems oddly familiar. Not even bad. Oddly familiar and oddly similar to that of The Last Temptation of Christ. And I just felt like when I was watching The Last Temptation of Christ, I definitely noticed the music more. It definitely just stood out to me more. So in terms of music, I'm going to give the edge to The Last Temptation of Christ. In terms of acting, again, there are a couple different avenues to take a look at when it comes to the performances in this film. There's obviously that of the supporting cast in both of these films, and there's, of course, the main role, whichever actor was chosen to play Jesus Christ. Now, in terms of the supporting cast, I feel like they were about the same, and maybe, because I look at The Last Temptation of Christ, and Barbara Hershey, I think, gives one of the standout performances in the entire cast. Harvey Keitel was okay. I think he got like a Razzie nomination for Worst Supporting Actor. I don't know if I'd go that far for him, but it is a little hard for him to, I guess, kind of disappear into that role for whatever reason. But at the same time, I look at the performances in The Passion of the Christ, and not only was the supporting cast very strong. Jim Caviezel played Jesus Christ in The Passion of the Christ, as opposed to Willem Dafoe in The Last Temptation of Christ. And as great as Dafoe was in The Last Temptation of Christ, I could see him in the role. He blended in with the role very well. Jim Caviezel did that and then some, because again, the vast majority of The Passion of the Christ is just the torture that Jesus Christ went through, and the big reason as to why that works so well is in large part because of Jim Caviezel's performance. It's obviously a very demanding performance, and at the same time, all the pain and suffering that's portrayed, like, it never feels like gratuitous, and never feels like it's being overdone. It's just captivating, but at the same time, it's just searing in every sense of the word. And throughout like the entire duration of the film, Jim Caviezel, I couldn't help but feel, just I couldn't help but feel like the anguish and torment that Christ went through the vehicle of Jim Caviezel's performance. So I got to give mainly for Jim Caviezel's performance, he was absolutely terrific. I got to give the edge in acting to the Passion of the Christ. Now, in terms of writing, the storytelling, or really the narrative writing, the screenplay, I'm definitely giving the edge to The Last Temptation of Christ. And the reason why is because The Passion of the Christ, in terms of narrative, it definitely takes a more simple route. And again, it feels like, I don't know if I'd say it feels like a bit more one note, but it definitely feels more focused on one aspect of the story of Jesus Christ. And even I look at the conversations and basically the dialogue between all the characters throughout The Passion of the Christ, and I can't say it's bad, so to say, maybe a tad bit dull or whatever, but it frails in comparison to that of The Last Temptation of Christ, because I loved the angle that it went through, the angle that it took in portraying the life story of Jesus Christ. I look at like a lot of the internal conflicts that were portrayed or really expressed throughout, like I said, just like the conversation between Christ, what Christ had in all of his followers, between Christ and his followers, and I just felt that more captivating. And I looked at, and I don't want to give away too much with this movie, because even though this movie is about 3 decades old, there's a certain twist to it all that threw me for a loop. And while it felt weird while it was happening, like once the film ended, I felt satisfied. I felt like it was absolutely worth it for that particular detour that they take. So in terms of writing, I think The Last Temptation of Christ definitely has a very clear edge. Now, in terms of direction, this is tough. Mel Gibson and Martin Scorsese are both very, very talented filmmakers. Like I said, they both took a lot of heat, a lot of controversy when it came to making these particular films. Martin Scorsese in particular had to take bodyguards with them to premiere events for The Last Temptation of Christ. I don't know if that's the same with Mel Gibson, but it wouldn't surprise me either way. Again, The Passion of the Christ definitely very much boasts the respect. It's very weird to say respectful brutality in how it portrays the last few hours of the life of Jesus Christ. But I got to give the edge to Martin Scorsese for The Last Temptation of Christ, and I very much tried to keep my own personal preferences in between these directors out of the question here. But definitely with the direction that Martin Scorsese took for The Last Temptation of Christ, there's something that felt, it was of course a very experimental approach, but there's something that felt very mystical about it. While both films feel very scary, the mysticism that is injected more into Martin Scorsese's film, it brings it past the finish line just a bit quicker than The Passion of the Christ. So my winner for this very, very first film fight on the show is The Last Temptation of Christ. All right, and finally, and to cap off this episode, I'm going to reveal my top 5 films of the 1960s. I'm liking the top 5 much more than the top 10. Feels just much quicker, just feels much better overall, doesn't drag. So, without further ado, my honorable mentions for the top 5 films of the 1960s are Psycho, Mary Poppins, Midnight Cowboy, The Apartment, Dr. Strangelove, Bonnie and Clyde, and Lawrence of Arabia. Coming in at number 5, all the way from 1961, is West Side Story. Two young adults from rival gangs in New York City fall in love, but things go south as the rivalry between their respective clans continues to build. Directed by Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins, adapted for the screen by Ernest Lehman, based on the stage musical by Jerome Robbins and Arthur Lawrence, and stars Natalie Wood, Richard Beymer, Russ Tamblyn, George Chakiris, hope I'm saying his name correctly, and Rita Moreno. One of the things that I admire most about this movie is just the grand scale that's associated with this. Again, it takes place across the, giant landscape of New York City. And on top of that, the direction is just absolutely dazzling with bringing in that huge scale with all the musical and dance sequences, which were, I think for the time, very ambitious. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of very poignant and moving drama. There's something very tongue-in-cheek about the screenplay. The film's about 2.5 hours long, so that tongue-in-cheek manner kind of makes the film feel lighter on its feet. But at the same time, with as light on its feet as it feels, that never makes it feel shallow. There's, of course, a very heartwarming and heartbreaking core to this movie, because, of course, this is basically Romeo and Juliet with gangs in New York City. But at the same time, this never felt like I can't really say this felt like the play that I had to read in the 9th grade. All right, coming in at number 4 from 1966 is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? A bitter middle-aged couple use a younger couple and alcohol to tear each other down over the course of one tense evening. The film was directed by Mike Nichols, based on the play by Edward Albee, and is adapted for the screen by, again, Ernest Lehman, and stars Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Sandy Dennis, and George Segal. Now, this is the directorial debut of Mike Nichols, easily among the most influential filmmakers to debut within the last few decades. He's gone on to make movies such as The Graduate, which I'll get to in just a second, but also Working Girl and Closer and Charlie Wilson's War. So the man's got a very impressive filmography, and this film was his directorial debut. Now, I'm currently working on 2 feature films, currently in the writing room for both of those, that I plan on directing. If my directorial debut is anywhere near as good as this directorial debut of Mike Nichols, I can die a hero. Because just take out the factor that this isn't his first time directing a feature film. This movie is fantastic. It's funny, it's scathing, it's tense, it's just razor sharp. And in terms of this being someone's directorial debut, this is about as good as it gets. I'm still stunned. And when I first found out that the person who directed this movie was a first-timer, I was stunned. I was absolutely shocked, and I think this says just exactly the kind of talented auteur that Mike Nichols was. May he rest in peace. He died a couple years ago. But basically, the entire nature of this movie is, if there was a rock fight between a couple of people and words were represented by rocks, everybody in this movie would walk away with a broken bone, a black eye, blood and cuts all over their face. Because everyone in this movie, especially the middle-aged couple, just uses words to beat the ever-living shit out of each other. They just all tackle the insecurities that they know about each other or knew about each other before this unfortunate evening, and even all the stuff that they learn about each other. They manage to find a way to make someone else in their circle feel small. And maybe it's not the most nice-spirited movie in the world, but at the same time, that it doesn't matter because this movie is just so entertaining. And also, too, This movie wouldn't work nearly as well if it wasn't for the performances from everybody across the board just being flat out amazing. Bravo on all fronts. Okay, number 3 from 1967 is The Graduate. Like I said before, I was going to get to this one soon. An aimless college graduate has an affair with an attractive older woman before falling in love with that woman's daughter. The film was directed by, once again, Mike Nichols, with a screenplay by Calder Willingham and Buck Henry, based on the novel by Charles Webb. Film stars Dustin Hoffman, Anne Bancroft, William Daniels, Elizabeth Wilson, and Catherine Ross. This film is very much, an anthem for the aimless, for the socially awkward, for the melancholic, and for the lonely. This film very much resonated with me when I watched it once again right after I finished college. And I think I watched it too, right after I quit my first job at ABC. It was a very, very transitional period in my life. So I think anyone who can harken back to the times where they didn't really know what their next move was going to be, upon finishing school or leaving a job or some kind of other major moment in their life. I think they can relate to this movie very well. Especially for those like still figuring out their lives after college. I mean, I'm 23. I just graduated last year, and as much as I feel like I've got a plan for the most part, that can change tomorrow, leaving me in like a Benjamin Braddock like situation. So again, among the reasons why this movie resonates so well, of course, it's very funny, it's very entertaining, it's beautifully filmed. I'll never forget the one scene where Benjamin Braddock is going after Elaine Robinson. He's going to visit her in Berkeley, where she goes to school. Visit might be being used a little loosely here, but there's just one scene where he's just like driving on the California highway. It's just like it's just one like very wide shot. Like it kind of looks like a shot that would like be done in like a helicopter or something, and it's just the scenery that the film captures on top of Benjamin Braddock just driving across America. Not really across America, but just driving across the state is just absolutely beautiful. And then, of course, too, the character dynamic between Benjamin Braddock and Mrs. Robinson. Again, he's this younger, awkward guy, like, not really sure, like, how to act in certain situations. And then, of course, you have Mrs. Robinson, classic Mrs. Robinson, that, again, is just very, like, stern, I guess, cold and cool, and very assertive woman. Definitely knows what she wants and does very much everything that she needs to in order to go after it. And this is apparent in not only the affair that the two have with each other, but also with the events that happen later in the film. The performances all around are terrific, especially Hoffman and Bancroft as, of course, Benjamin Braddock and Mrs. Robinson. Soundtrack, courtesy of Simon and Garfunkel, especially with, films in the 60s or music in the 60s, you can't do much better than Simon and Garfunkel. And I think, again, another thing that stands out so much about this movie is, like, the unopened and the uncertain and, like, ambiguous ending. And, again, I try very hard not to, give too much away, even with movies that are decades old, but it's the way this movie ends off, like, kind of says something about, like, decision-making from those that are young and in love, or at least young and infatuated, depending on how you look at it. And, again, this, even though, like I just sang the praises of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf before, about that being Mike Nichols' directorial debut, and it just being just so amazing, The Graduate, is his best work. And I think it's just amazing, like, how he had two back-to-back, like, killer movies so early in his career. Number 2, In the Heat of the Night, from 1967. A black detective is asked to investigate a murder in a racially tense Mississippi neighborhood. The film was directed by Norman Jewison, with a screenplay by Sterling Stillifant, based on the novel by John Ball, and stars Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger. Now, this movie actually won the Academy Award for Best Picture over The Graduate, and I think that's something that's been disputed by people here and there, and honestly, it's very close between the two, but I, of course, I'm giving a very, very slight edge to this movie. I think that is in large part due to the very sure-handed direction from Norman Jewison, and I think that talent on his end is present in the palpable sense of danger that currently lurks everywhere Virgil Tibbs goes in this town. That's the black detective, Virgil Tibbs. He's played by Sidney Poitier. And because, of course, this movie, came out in the 60s, and it takes place in, southern United States, which, again, of course, in terms of, racial issues, it wasn't exactly the most friendly place in the world. And so that sense of conflict, or really that sense of danger, is on full display throughout this entire movie, that, anything could happen to Virgil Tibbs at any moment, and it'd be perfectly fine, quote unquote. So on top of that, it's very insightful, it's very thought-provoking, and this is one of the few movies I've seen where a lot of times racial tension ends up being a two-way street. There's one line in the movie where Virgil Tibbs, feels like, he says something along the lines of, I can finally get a hand up on these people or whatnot, and then Rod Steiger's character, he plays the sheriff who works close hand with Virgil Tibbs. He turns right around on him and he says, you're just like the rest of us, ain't you, Virgil? Because he sees that, wanting us to, one-up the people on the other side of the racial spectrum. And then again, that just plays very much into the characterization that's developed between Rod Steiger's Gillespie as opposed to Sidney Poitier's Virgil Tibbs. And you have that Virgil Tibbs is definitely much smarter, much more analytical and acute than Gillespie, and Gillespie is obviously very much threatened by that because, of course, there's a black man that's smarter than him, the white man, and he's not necessarily okay with that, but the two still work very well together in terms of their characterization. They're brilliant foils for each other, and even just in terms of the performances from Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger, they're both absolutely terrific. They work very well together. They very much disappear into their roles, and I believe Rod Steiger in particular won the Academy Award. He absolutely deserved it. And as opposed to Sidney Poitier, who wasn't even nominated. I can't believe that he wasn't even nominated. He absolutely should have been. Like I said, there's a clear sense of danger throughout this entire movie. It's very intense. It's very funny. It's very sharp. And at the same time, it manages to be unpredictable. All right, at long last, my number one film of the 1960s comes from 1968, and that film is 2001, A Space Odyssey. After discovering a mysterious artifact beneath the surface of the moon, mankind launches a campaign beyond our atmosphere to investigate the finding. The film was directed by Stanley Kubrick and is written by Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke and stars Cara Delia, Gary Lockwood, and Douglas Rain. I watched this movie for the first time, I want to say when I was about 15 or 16 years old, and I can't say I disliked it, but I definitely didn't appreciate it then as much as I do now, because there's something about the movie that always felt like there was something more for me to appreciate, more for me to, I don't know, just watch and just, I don't know, maybe try and just capture some kind of wonder the second time around. But I recently saw the movie in a presentation of both IMAX and 75mm film with a couple friends of mine. And I have to say, the fact that this movie is over 50 years old and this movie was still as stunning of a movie theater experience as it was is absolutely incredible. This is one of the most memorable movie theater experiences I've ever had. Again, I'm sure the IMAX and 75mm additions to the showing, of course, give it a leg up. But at the same time, again, the fact that the movie is 50 years old and still holds up as much as it does is just absolutely insane. And again, there's a very much a grand, epic scale to it all. It's a very slow and steady interstellar adventure. It's definitely for a more patient moviegoer. So I could see why it wouldn't be for everybody. It was very controversial at the time of its release. I believe it was Rock Hudson who famously walked out of the of the premiere of the movie and basically saying something along the lines of, "Oh, this is not worthy of cinema. This is not worthy of Hollywood." But I'm going to be honest, a lot more people remember. I remember 2001: A Space Odyssey much more quickly than I remember Rock Hudson, so that says something about that. But again, this movie stands tall as much as it does because of just the amount of ground that it breaks in terms of its technical proficiency as well as its narrative, from the cinematography to, again, the imagery that's put on screen to the crazy special effects. And it's still stunning how much they hold up for the most part today. It just shows that Stanley Kubrick, Stanley Kubrick, who spearheaded the work on the visual effects. When the film won Best Visual Effects at the Oscars, he was actually the recipient of the award, and it just shows the kind of pioneer that he was. I think this movie very much shows a kind of unforgettable auteur, someone who's a master of his craft. Because I've seen a few of his movies, and I don't think any of them beat this one. Again, going from a narrative standpoint too, it's a thought-provoking take on the evolution of man. There's something that's very exhilarating and trippy about it. It feels like if you just dropped all kinds of acid and then just launch yourself in a rocket ship, that's what this movie would feel like. And then of course, who could forget the soundtrack? There's so much music in this movie that's mainly associated to being made for this movie, even though this movie used a lot of pre-recorded pop culture, not really pop culture soundtrack, but used a lot of pre-recorded soundtrack that wasn't necessarily an original score for this movie. Again, there's like I said, there's a sense of wonder that I was trying to find when watching this movie multiple times, and I definitely found it. Upon the most recent time that I watched it, it's again on top of it just being this huge grand adventure, but there's also something very mysterious and very eerie about it, and that sense of uncertainty is present throughout the entire 2-hour and 42-minute runtime, I believe it is. And the fact that it's able to hold up that sense of uncertainty for that long of a time with all the different chapters that it goes through, from the dawn of man to man's exploration of the of the moon and everything, and going into deep space. It's staggering. It's really something else. Even just on a narrative end too, like the movie ends off on. It takes a lot of like very weird directions, which again I think contributes to the controversy that the movie faced, back in the day when it first came out, and it's still something that I'm trying to wrap my mind around to this day, what exactly it all means. But at the same time, like knowing that it's Stanley Kubrick, I can't say it's just something that like didn't mean anything, had no point at all. There's definitely something there that I'm still trying to figure out, and that's something I can appreciate very much about the movie. And I think that's why, or that's one of the many reasons why, like it's stood the test of time and has been talked about for as long as it has. All right, so that's really it for this episode today. Keep an eye out for anything related to either Real Talk or Natural Multimedia. This is I believe, this is the first program of any kind to be associated with Natural Multimedia. So don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, share, and tune in next time. I'm Joe Acierno. This has been Real Talk.